A self-made millionaire publicly slapped his pregnant wife at the hospital. Her only response was a quiet promise. "You have no more power over me." What happened next left everyone stunned. He thought his money made him invincible, but he never realized the quiet doctor watching from the shadows was his wife's secret billionaire father, the hidden architect of his entire fortune. What happens when a father's protective instinct unleashes a storm of ruin? This is the story of a brutal betrayal and the epic redemption that followed. Before we begin, take a moment and comment your city below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from around the world. Now, let's dive in. The waiting room of the maternal fetal medicine unit at Lenox Hill Hospital was a study in muted anxiety. Soft grey chairs lined the walls. A generic landscape painting of a serene beach hung slightly askew, and the air hummed with the quiet whir of the ventilation system, a sound that did little to mask the silent prayers of the women seated within. Isabella Rossi, her hands resting protectively on the gentle swell of her 6-month pregnancy, tried to breathe through the tightness in her chest. It wasn't just the high-risk nature of her appointment that had her heart hammering against her ribs. It was the waiting for the specialist, waiting for answers, and, most agonizingly, waiting for her husband, Marcus Thorne. Marcus was never late. Punctuality was a cornerstone of the pristine image he projected to the world, the sharp, decisive, self-made millionaire who had clawed his way to the top of New York's ruthless real estate market. To his investors, he was a genius. To the society pages, he was one half of a golden couple. To Isabella, he was the architect of her beautiful, suffocating cage. She glanced at the Patek Philippe watch on her wrist, a birthday gift from him. 2:15 p.m. Her appointment was at 2 hours. He had promised, with that infuriatingly placid smile of his, that he would be there. "This is our child, Izzy," he'd said, his voice a low, smooth caress that always made the fine hairs on her arm stand on end. "Of course I'll be there. We're a team." But his words, once a source of comfort, had long since become another set of bars in her enclosure. A team, to Marcus, meant she was a supporting player in the grand production of his life. Her role was to be beautiful, gracious, and above all, compliant. This pregnancy, their joint project, was meant to be the crowning achievement, the final accessory to complete the picture of his success. A legacy. The problem was, the project had hit a snag. A routine ultrasound had revealed a potential complication, an issue with the placenta. The obstetrician had used calm, measured tones, but the referral to a top specialist had sent a jolt of pure terror through Isabella. She needed Marcus, not the polished CEO, but the man she had fallen in love with 5 years ago, the charming, ambitious developer who had seen her, a quiet art history graduate, and made her feel like the center of the universe. That man had all but vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger who measured love in carats and square footage. Her phone buzzed in her purse, a text from Marcus. "Running late, stuck in a meeting with the board. Can't be helped. You know how it is. Handle the preliminaries." No apology. No question about how she was feeling. It wasn't a message. It was a directive. Handle it. Isabella's fingers tightened on her phone. She knew how it is. A meeting with the board was his code for 1,000 different things. A long lunch, a round of golf, a schmoozing session that was always more important than whatever she needed. He had conditioned her to accept it, to nod and smile, and never question the hierarchy of his priorities. Her and the baby were somewhere on the list, but always below the Thorne real estate empire. A nurse called her name. Isabella Thorne? She flinched at the name. She had been Isabella Rossi for 26 years, a name that felt like her own. Thorn felt like a brand, a label of ownership. Taking a deep breath, she pushed herself to her feet, the weight of the baby shifting uncomfortably. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The nurse led her down a long, sterile corridor to an examination room. The routine was familiar. Blood pressure, weight, a series of questions she answered on autopilot. All the while, a cold dread pooled in her stomach. She was going through the motions alone, just as she had for most of the pregnancy. Marcus had been present for the first ultrasound, the one where they announced the gender. A boy, of course, to Marcus's immense satisfaction. He had clapped his friend, the doctor, on the back and declared, "An heir for the throne." He had been performing, even then. "Dr. Vance will be with you in a moment," the nurse said, with a kind, professional smile, before closing the door, leaving Isabella alone with the crinkling paper on the examination table and the frantic beating of her own heart. She stared at the blank white walls, her reflection a pale, worried ghost in the polished chrome of a medical instrument stand. She saw the designer maternity dress Marcus's assistant had picked out, the perfectly styled hair, the understated diamond earrings. She looked the part, Mrs. Marcus Thorne, but inside she was unraveling. The pregnancy had changed everything. It was no longer just her own unhappiness she had to consider. A child was coming into this world, a world curated and controlled by Marcus. What kind of mother would she be if she couldn't even stand up to her own husband? If she let him treat this baby as another acquisition? The door opened, and a man who was not Marcus entered. He was older, perhaps in his early 60s, with a calm, reassuring demeanor. He had kind, intelligent eyes the color of faded denim, framed by laugh lines, and a head of thick, silver hair. He wore simple blue scrubs, a stethoscope draped around his neck. He wasn't what she expected from a world-renowned specialist. He looked less like a high-powered Manhattan doctor and more like a small-town physician. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm Dr. Alistair Vance. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting." He didn't offer a handshake, just a warm, empathetic smile as he took a seat on the stool opposite her. He opened her file, but his eyes remained on her face, assessing, understanding. "I've reviewed your records. I know this must be a stressful time for you." There was something in his gaze, a deep, paternal kindness, that almost broke her. She felt an absurd urge to burst into tears, to confess everything. Not just her fears about the baby, but her fears about her marriage, her life. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "It is," she managed to say. "My husband. He was supposed to be here." Dr. Vance's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. "Well," he said softly, "why don't you and I get started? We'll face this together." For the first time all day, Isabella felt a tiny, fragile sliver of hope. She wasn't entirely alone, after all. The ultrasound was an exercise in quiet tension. Dr. Vance moved the transducer over Isabella's belly with a practiced, gentle hand, his eyes fixed on the grainy black and white images flickering across the monitor. He was silent for long stretches, his brow furrowed in concentration. Isabella held her breath, her own gaze locked on the screen, trying to decipher the shifting shapes and shadows. She could see the curve of her baby's spine, the flutter of his tiny heart, a frantic, beautiful rhythm that was the only source of comfort in the room. "Everything looks stable for now," Dr. Vance said finally, his voice a low murmur. He pointed to a specific area on the screen. "This is the area of concern. It's called placenta previa, where the placenta is covering the cervix. We need to monitor it closely. It can resolve on its own, but it carries risks." The most important thing right now is for you to avoid stress. Complete bed rest might be necessary down the line. Stress. The word hung in the air, thick and heavy. Isabella felt a bitter, hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. Avoiding stress in her life was like trying to avoid water in the ocean. As if on cue, the door to the examination room burst open without a knock. Marcus Thorne filled the doorway, a whirlwind of expensive cologne and palpable impatience. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his dark hair perfectly coiffed. He held his phone to his ear, his voice a sharp, commanding bark. "No, you tell Henderson the deal is off the table if he can't meet the revised terms by 5 o'clock. I don't care what his excuse is. Make it happen." He clicked the phone off, his eyes sweeping the room with an air of proprietary ownership. They landed on Isabella, then on Dr. Vance, and a frown creased his handsome face. "Well, it's about time," he said. Not as an apology, but as an accusation. "I've been waiting out there for 10 minutes. What's the verdict?" He didn't address Dr. Vance directly, instead looking at Isabella as if the doctor were a mere technician. Dr. Vance slowly wiped the gel from the transducer, his movements calm and deliberate, a stark contrast to Marcus's coiled energy. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his tone even, "I was just explaining to your wife that we've identified a condition called placenta previa. It requires careful monitoring." Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "Placenta what? Just fix it. That's what I pay for. The best! I was assured you were the best." He walked over to Isabella, but he didn't touch her. He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disappointment, as if she were a faulty piece of merchandise. "Isabella, did you hear that? You need to be more careful. All this emotional nonsense isn't good for the baby." "My son." The possessive pronoun struck Isabella like a physical blow. "My son. Not our son." "Marcus, the doctor said I need to avoid stress," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She hated how weak she sounded, how pleading. "Then stop being stressed," he retorted, as if it were that simple. "It's a choice. You're being dramatic. We have the gala for the Children's Foundation on Friday. You can't possibly be on bed rest. I've already confirmed our attendance. My company is the primary sponsor." Isabella stared at him, aghast. "A gala? Marcus, did you hear anything the doctor just said? This is serious." "Everything is serious with you, Izzy," he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in a theatrical display of exhaustion. "It's always some crisis. Just tell the doctor to give you a pill or whatever it is you need so you can be ready for Friday. This is important for my image, for our image." Dr. Vance quietly cleared his throat, drawing Marcus's irritated gaze. "Mr. Thorne, your wife's health and the health of your child are my only priorities. The gala is completely out of the question. In fact, I'd prefer for her to be admitted for observation for the next 24 hours. Marcus's face darkened. He finally turned his full, intimidating attention on the doctor. "And who are you to make that decision? I'm paying your exorbitant fees. You work for me." "No, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Vance replied, his voice still quiet but now laced with steel. "I work for my patient, your wife." He stood up, a solid, immovable presence. "And my recommendation stands. She needs rest and a stress-free environment. Immediately." The challenge, quiet as it was unmistakable. Marcus was not a man who took well to being challenged. His carefully controlled facade began to crack. A vein pulsed in his temple. "This is ridiculous," he seethed, turning back to Isabella. "This is your fault. You're always so fragile, so needy. I have an empire to run, and I have to come down here to listen to this nonsense because you can't handle a simple pregnancy." "Marcus, please," Isabella begged, tears welling in her eyes. "Not here." Her plea was the spark that lit the fuse. The public setting, the doctor's defiance, her tears. It was all a direct affront to his authority, to his control. "Don't you, Marcus, please me," he snarled, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You will not embarrass me. You will pull yourself together. You will walk out of this hospital, and you will be smiling on my arm on Friday night. Do you understand me?" "No," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It was a small word, but it was an act of rebellion she hadn't dared to commit in years. And that's when it happened. Marcus's hand moved in a blur. The sound was a sharp, ugly crack that echoed in the small, sterile room. Isabella's head snapped to the side, the sting on her cheek instantaneous and shocking. A collective gasp came from the hallway, where nurses and other patients had paused, drawn by the argument. The world seemed to slow down. The hum of the hospital equipment faded. All Isabella could feel was the burning on her skin and the profound, soul-crushing weight of her humiliation. He had done it, in public, in front of a doctor. He had finally shown the world the monster he kept hidden behind closed doors. She slowly turned her head back, her eyes meeting his. She saw no remorse in them, only cold, reptilian fury. But then, another figure moved into her line of sight. Dr. Vance had stepped between them, shielding her from Marcus. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't moved quickly, but his presence was suddenly immense, a wall of quiet, unshakable authority. "Get out," Dr. Vance said. His voice was dangerously soft, a quiet rumble that promised a storm. "Get out of my hospital. Now." Marcus, momentarily stunned by his own actions, blinked. He looked from the doctor's implacable face to the horrified stares of the people in the hallway. For the first time, a flicker of panic entered his eyes. The facade was not just cracked, it was shattered. The silence that followed the slap was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It was broken only by Isabella's ragged, indrawn breath. The sting on her cheek was blossoming into a hot, throbbing ache, a physical manifestation of the shame that was flooding her system. Her hand rose instinctively to her face, her fingers trembling as they ghosted over the inflamed skin. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his chest heaving. The shock of his own action seemed to reverberate through him. His eyes darted around, taking in the scene. The open door, the stunned faces of the nurses in the hallway, Isabella's tear-streaked face, and the doctor who stood between them like a granite statue. The mask of the charming millionaire was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly face of a bully caught in the act. He tried to recover, to reassert the control that was so vital to his existence. He straightened his tie, a gesture of normalcy that was utterly absurd in the charged atmosphere. "This is a private matter," he said, his voice tight and strained. He directed his words at Dr. Vance, but his eyes were on the audience in the hall. "My wife is overwrought. She's not herself." Dr. Vance didn't move. He didn't even blink. He remained positioned squarely in front of Isabella, a human shield. "Assaulting a pregnant woman is not a private matter, Mr. Thorne," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it all the more chilling. "It's a crime, and you did it in my hospital, in front of my staff." He turned his head slightly. "Nurse Jennings, please call security." A nurse in the hallway, a woman with wide, horrified eyes, nodded jerkily and fumbled for her phone. Panic flared in Marcus's eyes. Security. A scene. This was a public relations nightmare, a catastrophe that could unravel the pristine image he had spent a decade building. "Now let's not be hasty," he said, attempting a placating tone that sounded grotesque after his violence. "There's no need for security. It was a misunderstanding, a family squabble." He tried to step around Dr. Vance to get to Isabella. "Izzy, honey, tell the doctor it's okay." Tell him we're fine. Isabella shrank back on the examination table, pulling away from the sound of his voice, from the very thought of his touch. The endearment, honey, felt like acid on her raw nerves. She couldn't speak. She could only shake her head, a small, desperate movement. Dr. Vance took a half step, blocking Marcus's path. "You will not go near her," he commanded. The softness was gone from his voice, replaced by an absolute, non-negotiable authority that seemed to emanate from his very core. "You have done enough damage for one day." Marcus, for the first time in his adult life, found himself facing an immovable object. He was used to people cowering. He was used to his money, his power, his sheer force of will bending the world to his desires. This quiet, unassuming doctor in scrubs was not bending. He was not intimidated. He was not impressed. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Marcus hissed, falling back on his last and most trusted weapon, his own perceived importance. "I could buy this entire hospital wing and have you fired by morning. I am Marcus Thorne." He said the name as if it were an incantation, a spell that should make all obstacles crumble. Dr. Vance looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, Isabella saw something other than calm professionalism in the doctor's eyes. It was a profound, almost pitying contempt. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Vance said, his voice low and steady. "You're a man who strikes his pregnant wife. In my book, that makes you nothing." The insult, delivered so calmly, was more effective than any shout. It struck Marcus at his core, at the fragile ego that lay beneath the bluster. His face contorted with rage. "You're finished," Marcus spat. "I'll ruin you. You'll be practicing medicine in a back-alley clinic by the time I'm done with you. I will personally see to it." Two uniformed security guards appeared in the doorway, their presence immediately changing the dynamic of the room. They were large men, their expressions grim and professional. "Is there a problem here, Dr. Vance?" one of them asked, his hand resting near his belt. "Yes, there is," Dr. Vance replied, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "This man assaulted a patient. I want him escorted off the premises, and I want a formal report filed with the NYPD. "You can't do that!" Marcus sputtered, his composure finally shattering completely. He looked wildly between the guards and the doctor. "This is a misunderstanding. I have rights." "Your rights ended when your hand made contact with my patient's face," Dr. Vance said coldly. "Now, you can leave with the guards peacefully, or they can remove you by force. The choice is yours. But make no mistake, you are leaving." The guards stepped forward. Marcus looked at their impassive faces, then back at the doctor's unyielding gaze. He was trapped, checkmated. The raw, physical power he held over Isabella was useless here. His financial power had met a wall of integrity he couldn't comprehend. He cast one last, venomous look at Isabella. "You'll regret this," he mouthed silently, a promise of retribution. Then, with a final, pathetic attempt at dignity, he turned and walked out of the room, flanked by the two guards. The small crowd in the hallway parted for him, their faces a mixture of disgust and fear. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room deflated, leaving a vacuum of shock and misery. The kind nurse, Jennings, rushed in with a cool cloth. "Oh, you poor dear," she murmured, gently dabbing at Isabella's cheek. Isabella flinched, not from pain, but from the simple human kindness. It was so foreign, so unexpected, that it broke through her shock. A sob escaped her lips, then another, until she was weeping uncontrollably, her body shaking with the force of her grief and fear. Through the blur of her tears, she saw Dr. Vance. He had pulled the door partially closed, giving her a semblance of privacy. He stood watching her, his expression unreadable, but for the deep, aching sorrow in his eyes. He wasn't just a doctor looking at a patient. It was something more, something deeper. It was as if her pain was his own. He waited until her sobs began to subside into shuddering breaths. Then he spoke, his voice so gentle it was almost a whisper. "Isabella," he said. He used her first name. Not Mrs. Thorne, Isabella. And the way he said it was with a familiarity that sent a strange, confusing shiver down her spine. "You're safe now," he continued, his gaze holding hers. "He will never hurt you again. I promise." It was a powerful, impossible promise for a doctor to make to a patient. But as Isabella looked into the depths of his faded denim eyes, she felt a flicker of belief. There was more to this quiet, silver-haired man than she could possibly understand. And she had a sudden, overwhelming feeling that her life, in the span of one horrific, violent afternoon, had just irrevocably changed. The aftermath of Marcus's forced departure left a ringing silence in the room. Nurse Jennings had finished tending to Isabella's cheek, her touch gentle, her eyes full of a sympathy that Isabella found both comforting and deeply embarrassing. She had offered Isabella a cup of water, and then, with a final reassuring squeeze of her shoulder, had slipped out, leaving her alone with Dr. Vance. The doctor had moved to the window, his back to her, affording her a moment to compose herself. He seemed to be looking out at the sprawling concrete canyons of Manhattan, but Isabella sensed his attention was still entirely focused on her. The silence stretched, no longer tense, but thick with unspoken questions. Isabella's mind was a maelstrom. The humiliation of the slap warred with a terrifying uncertainty about her future. Marcus's parting threat echoed in her ears. "You'll regret this." She knew he meant it. His vengeance would be swift and total. He would freeze her accounts, lock her out of their apartment, and launch a vicious smear campaign, painting her as an unstable, hysterical gold digger. He would use every ounce of his power to crush her. And what power did she have? None. She was a bird with gilded feathers but broken wings, entirely dependent on the man who had just assaulted her. "He'll take everything," she whispered to the quiet room, the words a stark admission of her own helplessness. "The apartment, the money. He'll say I'm an unfit mother. He'll try to take the baby." Dr. Vance turned from the window. His face was etched with a profound sadness. He walked back to the stool and sat down, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees. "The apartment on Park Avenue is not his to take," he said, his voice calm and factual. Isabella stared at him, confused. "What? Of course it is. Everything is his. The Thorne name is on everything." "No," Dr. Vance corrected gently. "The Thorne name is on the mortgage. The deed, however, is held by a blind trust. A trust that I control." Isabella's breath hitched. A blind trust? She had signed countless financial documents over the years, her eyes glazing over at the legalese, trusting Marcus when he'd said it was just standard procedure. She had never once questioned his authority. I don't understand," she stammered. Dr. Vance's kind eyes held hers. "There's a great deal you don't understand, Isabella, and for that, I am more sorry than you can ever know." He paused, as if gathering the strength to say what came next. "Your husband's company, Thorne Development, his initial seed money, the capital that launched his empire. It didn't come from a savvy investment, as he claims. It came from an anonymous benefactor. Me." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Isabella felt a wave of dizziness. This was impossible. A fantasy. Why would this man, a doctor she had just met, have any involvement in her husband's business? "Why?" she asked, the word a faint puff of air. "Why would you do that?" This was the moment. The air grew still, charged with the weight of a secret held for a lifetime. Dr. Vance's gaze softened, the professional veneer dissolving completely, replaced by an emotion so raw, so powerful, it struck Isabella speechless. It was a look of infinite love, tinged with a deep, abiding pain. 28 years ago, he began, his voice thick with emotion. A brilliant, beautiful young artist named Sophia Rossi fell in love with a medical student who had nothing to offer her but his heart. They were married. They were ecstatically happy. A year later, she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. Sophia had a congenital heart condition, something we thought was manageable. But the strain of childbirth was too much. She died just a few days after the baby was born. Her last wish was that her daughter be kept safe, away from the world that had taken her so young. Isabella's heart began to pound, a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Sophia Rossi, her mother, the mother she'd never known, who had died when she was an infant. She had been raised by her maternal grandparents, who had told her that her father, overwhelmed with grief, had relinquished his rights and disappeared. The medical student, Dr. Vance continued, his voice cracking. He was devastated. He blamed himself, but he was also the son of a very, very wealthy man. A man whose world was filled with danger, with rivals, with people who would not hesitate to use a child as leverage. To honor his wife's last wish, to keep his daughter safe, he made the hardest decision of his life. He let her grandparents raise her, believing he had abandoned them. He created a new identity, finished medical school under a different name, and watched her from a distance, always. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture so staggering, so world-altering, that Isabella's mind could barely contain it. The kind eyes, the gentle voice, the fierce, paternal protectiveness, the name he had used. Isabella, not Mrs. Thorne. She looked at the man before her, Dr. Alistair Vance. And then she looked past the scrubs, past the title, and saw the truth. A truth that had been hidden in plain sight her entire life. He funded her education, Dr. Vance said, his voice now a choked whisper. He made sure she never wanted for anything. And when she fell in love with an ambitious, ruthless man, he investigated him. He saw the darkness in Marcus Thorne, but his daughter was in love. So, he did the only thing he could think of to protect her. He anonymously funded her husband's company. He bought their home through a trust. He placed her in a gilded cage, but one where he, not her husband, held the key. He did it all so that if the day ever came that the monster revealed himself, he could burn the cage to the ground and set her free. Tears were streaming down Dr. Vance's face now, silent and unchecked. "My name," he said, his voice breaking completely. "My real name is not Alistair Vance. It's Alistair Rossi. And that medical student, that grieving young father, Isabella, it was me. The world stopped. The air left Isabella's lungs. The man sitting before her, the doctor who had just defended her, was not a stranger. He was her father." The word echoed in the silent chambers of her heart, a word she had never dared to speak. Father. The billionaire philanthropist Alistair Vance, whose name she had seen on hospital wings and university buildings, was the ghost who had haunted her life. And he was here. He had been here all along. The shock was a physical force, so immense it left no room for any other emotion. She could only stare at the man who claimed to be her father, this impossible, unbelievable truth settling over her like a shroud, changing everything she thought she knew about who she was and where she came from. The revelation hung in the air, a seismic shock that had fractured the foundations of Isabella's world. Her father. The word was both alien and deeply resonant. She stared at Alistair, tracing the lines of his face, searching for a resemblance, for some flicker of recognition in the deep well of her memory. She saw the shape of his eyes, the curve of his brow, and suddenly she saw a faint echo of her own reflection. The shock gave way to a tidal wave of conflicting emotions. There was a profound, bone-deep relief, the feeling of an anchor finally finding purchase after a lifetime adrift. But beneath it was a current of anger and a sharp, piercing sense of abandonment. "You left me," she said, her voice hollow. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of a long-held, painful fact. All these years, you were alive. You were watching me. You let me believe I was an orphan. Alistair flinched as if she had struck him. The pain in his eyes was so raw, so genuine, it took her breath away. "I know," he whispered, his voice ragged with guilt. "Isabella, I know. There hasn't been a day in 28 years that I haven't been consumed by that choice. It was a foolish, cowardly decision made by a grief-stricken boy who thought he was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting you from my father's world. The greed, the enemies, the constant threat. I built a fortress around you, but I locked myself out. Can you ever forgive me?" Forgiveness felt like a distant country she wasn't sure how to find. How could she process a lifetime of absence in a single moment? Before she could answer, a sharp, authoritative knock sounded at the door. A woman in a crisp, dark suit entered, her expression calm and efficient. She carried a tablet and exuded an aura of quiet competence. "Alistair," she said, her voice low. "It's in motion." Alistair nodded, his demeanor shifting. The grieving father receded, and in his place was a man of immense power and authority. "Isabella," he said, turning back to her. "This is Eleanor Vance, my sister. Your aunt." Isabella looked at the woman, who gave her a small, sad smile. There was a family resemblance here, too. The same intelligent eyes, the same air of quiet strength. An aunt. She had an aunt. "Eleanor runs the Vance Foundation," Alistair explained, "but her true talent lies in crisis management. She's the one who has been keeping the legal and financial walls of your cage in place all these years." Eleanor stepped forward. "Isabella, I am so sorry for the part I played in this deception. But right now, we need to move quickly. Marcus will not go down without a fight. He's already on the phone with his lawyers, preparing to spin this." "What's happening?" Isabella asked, feeling like a spectator in her own life. "A reckoning," Alistair said, his voice turning cold and hard. "While you and I were talking, Eleanor initiated the protocols we put in place years ago for this very contingency." Eleanor tapped her tablet. "First, a temporary restraining order has been filed, citing the assault. Marcus is legally barred from coming within 500 feet of you or this hospital. Second, the Board of Thorn Development has been convened for an emergency meeting. They are currently being briefed on certain financial irregularities I have been tracking for the past 3 years. The anonymous benefactor who launched his company is withdrawing all assets and calling in all Marcus, effective immediately. By the end of the day, Marcus Thorn will be a CEO without a company." Isabella listened, stunned. It was a corporate execution, swift and merciless. "The apartment," Eleanor continued, her tone clinical, "is owned by the Rossi Family Trust. His access cards have been deactivated. The locks are being changed as we speak. A security team is packing his personal belongings, which will be delivered to his office, or what's left of it." "His money," Isabella began. "Largely an illusion," Alistair interjected, his contempt for Marcus palpable. "Built on my capital and leveraged to the hilt. The credit lines he used to fund his extravagant lifestyle are being frozen. The accounts you shared have been firewalled. A new private account has been opened in your name, Isabella Rossi, with a balance that will ensure you and your son will never want for anything. It was overwhelming. The intricate, invisible web of control Marcus had woven around her was being systematically dismantled in a matter of hours by a far greater, far more patient power. Her phone began to buzz incessantly on the side table. She glanced at the screen. Marcus Thorne. He was calling, again and again. Then, a string of texts began to pour in. Izzy, pick up the phone. We need to talk. This is a misunderstanding. That doctor is manipulating you. Don't do this, Isabella. You're destroying our family. I love you. Don't let them do this to us. The final text, so transparent in its pathetic desperation, made her feel sick. Love was not a word in Marcus's vocabulary. Control, possession, power. Those were the words he understood. Alistair saw her looking at the phone. You don't have to answer that. You never have to speak to him again if you don't want to. I know, she said softly. A different kind of security guard appeared at the door, this one in a plain suit with an earpiece. Sir, the car is ready. The suite is secure. Suite? Isabella asked. You're not staying here, Alistair said firmly. I have a private wing at the Carlisle. It's secure, comfortable, and has a full medical staff on standby. You will have the best care and complete privacy for the remainder of your pregnancy. You need rest. You need peace. He was taking over, his planning as meticulous and far-reaching as Marcus's had ever been, but the intent was entirely different. This wasn't about control, it was about protection. Still, a part of her bristled. For years, she had been passed from the control of her grandparents to the control of her husband. Was she now just trading one cage for another, albeit a more benevolent one? She looked at her father, at this powerful, wealthy stranger who had orchestrated her life from the shadows. She saw the guilt and the love warring in his eyes. He wasn't trying to own her. He was trying to atone. Okay, she said, the word feeling momentous. It was her choice, the first of many she would now have to make for herself. Okay, Dad. The word hung in the air between them. Alistair's composure finally broke. A single tear rolled down his cheek, but this time it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of absolution. As Eleanor helped her gather her things, and Alistair spoke quietly with the security detail, Isabella felt the first, tentative stirrings of a new reality. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was being overshadowed by something else, a sense of possibility. The bars of her cage had not just been opened. The entire structure was being demolished, and in its place was a vast, terrifying, and exhilarating open sky. The suite at the Carlisle was less a hotel room and more a palace in the sky. It occupied half a floor, with breathtaking views of Central Park, the autumn leaves a tapestry of gold and crimson. The rooms were filled with tasteful art, plush furnishings, and an overwhelming sense of quiet. It was the most luxurious place Isabella had ever been, and yet it felt as sterile and lonely as the hospital room she had just left. Her father, it was still so strange to think the word, had ensured every comfort. A private nurse was on call, a chef was available to prepare anything she desired, and a team of security guards maintained a discreet but constant presence in the hallway. She was safe. She was cared for. And she had never felt more lost. For 2 days, she drifted through the opulent rooms in a state of emotional numbness. She slept for hours, the exhaustion of years of stress finally catching up with her. When she was awake, she would stand by the vast windows, watching the city move below, feeling utterly disconnected from it all. Alistair was a constant, gentle presence. He didn't push or pry. He would sit with her in silence for hours, reading a book or simply watching the park with her. He brought her meals himself, coaxing her to eat with a quiet, paternal concern that was both comforting and painful. He was trying so hard to bridge the chasm of 28 years, one small gesture at a time. On the third evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the park, he found her in the living room, curled up on a sofa, a cashmere blanket pulled up to her chin. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, taking a seat in an armchair opposite her. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Numb, confused, angry. You have every right to be," he said, his voice heavy with the familiar weight of his guilt. At me. Most of all, Isabella looked at him, at this man who was both a stranger and the other half of her DNA. The numbness was beginning to recede, and in its place, the raw, jagged edges of her pain were making themselves known. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she asked, the question that had been circling in her mind for days. "When I was 18? When my grandparents died? I was alone. I would have understood. I would have had a father." The last words were a whisper, full of a child's longing. Alistair leaned forward, his face a mask of regret. "I wanted to," he said, his voice thick. "God, I wanted to. I came to your grandparents' funeral. I stood at the back, behind a tree, like a coward. I saw you, so strong and so sad, and I almost walked right up to you. But the fear, it was paralyzing." "Fear of what?" she pressed. "Your father was gone by then, wasn't he? The dangers of his world?" "Some of them," he admitted. "My father left a complicated legacy. Enemies who held grudges. But the truth is, the biggest fear wasn't for your safety anymore. It was of your rejection. I had built this narrative in my head that I was a monster who had abandoned his child. How could I possibly show up after 18 years of silence and expect you to welcome me? What right did I have to disrupt your life, to inflict my own baggage on you? So I did nothing. I stayed in the shadows, telling myself it was for the best. It was the greatest mistake of my life." His confession was raw and unvarnished. He wasn't making excuses. He was laying his failures bare. Isabella felt a flicker of empathy. She understood what it was to be paralyzed by fear. She had lived that way for years with Marcus. "You said you investigated him," she said, changing the subject, unable to linger on the pain of his absence. "You knew what he was like." Alistair nodded grimly. "I saw the ambition, the ruthlessness. I saw that he didn't love you, not in the way you deserved. He saw you as an asset, a beautiful piece to complete his collection. But you were happy, or you seemed to be. You were smiling, you were in love with the idea of him, and I didn't have the right to take that away from you. I thought my money could be a shield. I thought by controlling his finances, I could control him, keep his worst impulses in check. I was wrong. I underestimated the depths of his cruelty. You couldn't have known he would." She couldn't finish the sentence, her hand unconsciously drifting to her cheek. "No," Alistair said, his voice hardening. "But I should have. I should have pulled you out of there the moment I saw the light start to fade from your eyes. I saw it happening over the past few years. I saw you getting quieter, more withdrawn. But I kept telling myself it was my place to interfere. Another failure. Another scar." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their shared history, of all the things left unsaid and undone, filling the room. The city lights began to twinkle on, a diamond spray against the velvet dark. Finally, Isabella spoke. "My grandparents, did they know?" "They knew I was alive," he said. "They didn't know the details of my life, or who I had become. It was part of the arrangement. They agreed it was best for you to have a simple, normal life. They loved you, Isabella. More than anything, they did what they thought was right. It was another piece of the puzzle, another layer to the story of her life. It wasn't a simple story of abandonment. It was a complex tapestry of love, grief, fear, and misguided protection. Nothing was black and white. "I need to see him," Isabella said suddenly, the thought crystallizing in her mind with absolute clarity. Alistair looked alarmed. "Marcus, absolutely not. It's not safe." "No," she said, shaking her head. "Not to go back to him. I need to face him. One last time. On my terms. I can't let the last memory I have of him be of him slapping me in that hospital. I can't let him have that power." She saw the fear in her father's eyes, the instinct to wrap her in cotton wool and hide her from the world. But she also saw a flicker of understanding, of respect. She was not a fragile doll to be protected. She was a woman who needed to reclaim her own strength. "I spent 5 years being silent," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger, more resolute. "I let him shrink me, make me feel small and worthless. I won't be silent anymore. I need to tell him that he has no power over me. Not anymore." Alistair studied her face, seeing the new steel in her eyes, the resolve in the set of her jaw. He was seeing, perhaps for the first time, the woman his daughter had become, not in spite of her circumstances, but because of them. He was seeing the strength she had inherited from her mother, Sophia. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Okay," he said, "on your terms, but not alone. Never alone again." In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. The chasm of 28 years had not been bridged, not completely, but they had taken the first tentative steps onto the structure. The scars of silence would always be there, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were a part of their story, a testament to the pain they had endured and the love that had, against all odds, survived. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a private conference room at the law offices of Eleanor Vance's firm in Midtown. It was a space designed for high-stakes negotiation, a fortress of mahogany, leather, and soundproofed glass. From the 40th floor window, the city looked like a scale model, its power and noise reduced to a silent, intricate pattern. Isabella felt a tremor of anxiety as she walked in, but it was different from the fear she had lived with for years. This was the nervous energy of a fighter stepping into the ring, not a victim walking to the gallows. Her father was at her side, a quiet, solid presence. Eleanor was already there, seated at the head of the long table, a stack of files neatly arranged before her. Marcus was brought in a few minutes later. The change in him was shocking. The impeccably tailored suit was slightly rumpled. His face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a desperate, haunted look. He had aged 5 years in as many days. He looked not like a master of the universe, but like a man who had watched his universe burn to the ground. His eyes found Isabella's immediately. There was a flicker of hope in them, a pathetic belief that he could still manipulate her, that he could somehow reverse the cataclysm that had befallen him. "Izzy," he said, his voice raspy. "Thank God. I knew you'd come to your senses. We can fix this. You just have to tell them to stop." Isabella took her seat opposite him, Alistair and Eleanor flanking her. She didn't speak, just looked at him, her expression calm and unreadable. Her silence unnerved him more than any outburst would have. "This is insane," Marcus continued, his voice rising. He gestured wildly at Alistair. "This man, this ghost, he's destroyed me. My company is in receivership. The board has ousted me. The SEC is launching an investigation. My life is over. All because of a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Eleanor's voice cut through his tirade, as sharp and cold as breaking glass. Let's be clear about what has happened, Mr. Thorne. You didn't build an empire. You were the manager of a portfolio that belonged to my brother. You leveraged his assets, took all the credit for the successes, and hid the failures. You called it Thorne development. We called it a long-term character test. You failed. She pushed a file across the table. This is a summary of the forensic accounting investigation. It details years of embezzlement, of diverting corporate funds to personal accounts, of fraudulent expense reports. You weren't just a bad husband, Mr. Thorne. You're a common thief. Marcus stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake. He was speechless. The SEC investigation will likely lead to criminal charges, Eleanor continued relentlessly. Fraud, embezzlement. With your assets frozen, you'll have a hard time affording a decent lawyer. You'll be lucky to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes wide with genuine terror. Prison. The concept was so alien, so impossible, it had clearly never entered his mind. He turned his desperate gaze back to Isabella. Isabella, please, he begged, his voice cracking. You can't let this happen. Think of our son. What will he think of his father? It was the wrong thing to say. The mention of her son ignited a cold, hard flame in Isabella's chest. He will think his father is a man who hit his pregnant mother, she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He will think his father is a bully and a coward, but he won't have to think about that for very long, because you will not be a part of his life. Marcus recoiled. You can't do that. I have rights. You have no rights, Isabella stated, her voice unwavering. You have only the consequences of your actions. She leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. I didn't come here to negotiate, Marcus. I didn't come here to save you. I came here to look you in the eye and tell you that you have no more power over me. The fear is gone. The silence is over. She stood up, a signal that the meeting was at an end. You built your life on a foundation of lies and cruelty. You treated me like a possession, and our child like a legacy project. But you don't own me, and you will never, ever be a father to my son. She looked at him one last time, at the pathetic, broken man sitting amidst the ashes of his self-made kingdom. She felt no pity. She felt no anger. She felt nothing at all. He was a ghost to her now, a phantom from a life that was no longer hers. Goodbye, Marcus, she said. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, her father and her aunt following her. She didn't look back. She walked down the long hallway, past the windows overlooking the city, her head held high. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if she were shedding a heavy, suffocating skin she had worn for years. Behind her, in the silent conference room, Marcus Thorne finally broke. He slumped forward, his head in his hands, and let out a dry, ragged sob. It was the sound of a hollow man realizing, far too late, that he had lost everything, not because of a billionaire's revenge, but because of the rot within his own soul. His empire of lies had crumbled, leaving nothing behind but dust and the bitter taste of ashes. A month later, Isabella stood in the middle of an empty Soho loft. Sunlight streamed through the enormous arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The space was vast and open, with exposed brick walls, polished hardwood floors, and the faint, lingering scent of oil paint and turpentine. It was a blank canvas. Her blank canvas. After leaving the law office, she had not returned to the gilded cage of the Carlyle. She had thanked her father, hugged her aunt, and then checked into a small boutique hotel under the name Isabella Rossi. She needed space. She needed to breathe her own air, to make her own decisions, no matter how small. The divorce had been swift and silent. Faced with the mountain of evidence against him and the threat of a public, humiliating trial, Marcus had signed everything. He relinquished all parental rights in exchange for Eleanor's agreement not to pursue certain private fraud charges that would have guaranteed a maximum security sentence. He still faced the SEC, but his fate was no longer Isabella's concern. He had vanished from her life. Her relationship with Alistair was a work in progress. It was fragile, tentative, and marked by long conversations, and even longer, comfortable silences. He was learning to be a father, and she was learning to have one. He had offered her the world, a penthouse, a trust fund, a life of effortless luxury. She had politely refused. She would accept his help, his support, but she would not accept his control, no matter how benevolent. She needed to build something of her own, which led her here, to this loft. Before Marcus, she had been a promising art history graduate with a passion for restoration. She had dreamt of opening her own small studio, of spending her days giving new life to old, forgotten masterpieces. Marcus had scoffed at the idea, calling it a cute hobby, and had pushed her into a life of charity galas and society lunches. Now that dream was being reborn. Alistair, in a gesture she had accepted, had purchased the loft for her through a new trust, one that was solely in her name. It was both a studio and a home, a place where her life and her work could coexist. A delivery man arrived with the first piece of her new life, a large, sturdy wooden easel. Isabella directed him to the center of the room, right in the patch of morning sun. After he left, she ran her hand over the smooth, sanded wood. It was a simple object, but it felt profound. It was a tool, a promise. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her father, thinking of you on your first day. Your mother would be so proud. I am too. Tears pricked her eyes. She typed back a simple reply. Thank you, Dad. She placed a hand on her belly, which was now a prominent, perfect sphere. The baby kicked, a strong, reassuring thump against her palm. The doctors at Lenox Hill, under Dr. Vance's watchful eye, had confirmed that the placenta previa was resolving on its own. Her son was healthy. He was strong. The past few months had been a trial by fire. She had walked through the inferno of betrayal, humiliation, and fear. She had faced the monster in her life and had found her voice. She had unearthed a family she never knew she had and was slowly, carefully, piecing together a new identity from the fragments of the old. There were still scars, the memory of Marcus's hand, the sting of his words, the years of quiet desperation. Those things didn't simply vanish, but they no longer defined her. They were a part of her story, a dark chapter that gave the current one its brilliant, hopeful light. She was not just a survivor. She was a restorer, and her first project was herself. Looking around the empty loft, she didn't see a void. She saw potential. She saw a space to be filled with art, with laughter, with the coos of a newborn baby. She saw a future she would build with her own 2 hands. She took a deep, cleansing breath, the sunlight warm on her face. It was the first day of the rest of her life. And for the first time in a very long time, Isabella Rossi felt completely, utterly free. And there you have it, a story of betrayal, hidden secrets, and the incredible strength it takes to reclaim your life. Isabella's journey shows us that sometimes our lowest moments are the catalyst for our greatest transformations. The truth has a way of coming to light, and the power of family, even one that's been broken, can be the ultimate force for justice and healing. If this story of resilience and redemption moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true-to-life emotional stories every week. Your support means the world and allows us to keep bringing these narratives to you. Thank you for watching.